My wife sometimes says that I'm not always paying attention because I've got too much prose in my head. She's not wrong. She's not wrong. I often find in conversation, maybe this happens to most of us, most writers, that a part of you is always thinking about that paragraph you're working on, or how did you put this? And suddenly, zing, it will come to you. That's how you put it.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Paul Dodgson, and today I'm pleased to introduce a memoirist, novelist, journalist, podcast host and writer of books about history. He's covered big subjects in his books, among other things terrorism, the Pyrenees, immigration, and his latest work, Darwin's Savages, Science, Race and the Conquest of Patagonia. Welcome, Matt Carr.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
The book I just mentioned, Darwin's Savages, came out earlier this year. Are you working on the next one yet, or are you having a bit of a rest?
I've sent a proposal off for another book. It's set in South America, actually.
Okay, so
but I'm waiting for the verdict. So fingers crossed, a nervous period.
That's appropriate because we'll be talking about uncertainty later.
Okay, great.
Now, we're in the awards season, the Nobel Prize for Literature this month and the Booker next. And I suppose that for one writer to win an award, it means that lots more of us haven't. And sadly, I'm in the camp of those who haven't. Matt,
same here.
Well, I mean, what do you think about literary awards? Are they helpful in promoting the idea of books and reading, or do they elevate winners to the exclusion of the rest of us?
It's a difficult judgment to make, isn't it? Because especially if you're somebody who hasn't won one and you make a judgment saying that they're not productive, then you could be accused of envy. Generally, I'm in favour of them. I think they draw a lot of attention to books and writers. And bearing in mind, in the world we have now, where you have kind of, influencers dominating whole political narratives of entire countries and continents, we need writers to find spaces where they can. We need to hear from people like Annie Ernaux, that great speech she gave when she won the Nobel Prize, So on balance, yes, there's a tendency that there can be the focus on the winners and the writer as celebrity, but I would still think the overall, it's a positive thing, I think, especially when you see people like Annie Ernaux speak so well about writing and the whole craft of it and so on.
Do awards influence your reading choices?
Never, to be honest, never. I can't think of any time they ever have. I don't read for those reasons. I mean, that's partly choice, and it's partly, I've always been attracted to sort of margins in what I read. Even when I was younger, I would look for what was not on the syllabus. I don't know why. It wasn't any kind of desire to seem clever. I was just drawn to the margins. Hence, my newsletter and my blog are called From the Margins, because that's the position I've always been in as a writer and probably as a reader. I will sometimes read people who have won awards. I'm not against it, but that's not what draws me. I don't look to see who's won the Booker Prize and then think, right, I've got to have those, unless something really catches my attention.
So I think in 2023, Paul Lynch won the Booker with Prophet Song, which was a dystopian novel. And I read it because it won. I mean, not because it won the award, but because it was everywhere. And, I'd turn on the radio and I'd hear an extract. And I'd open a newspaper and I'd find something being written about it. And I think that drew me to it, and it matched my dystopian mood at the time.
Yeah, well, I can understand that. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, my daughter read that book, and I always respect her reading choices, and so I may well get round to reading it at some point. But the thing is, I often find that when preparing a book, I have to immerse myself so much in the subject that I'll be reading all kinds of very specialist books connected with it, and I just don't have the time. I sometimes think I'd like to have a bit of time. I could just be in a reading group or something and just read at random instead of always the stuff you have to read, you need to read, But I rarely get that time.
Absolutely. I mean, if you could win an award, any award in the world, which one would it be?
The Oscar? No, really, I haven't really thought it through. I never, when I wanted to be a writer, when I first had the idea, I wanted to do this thing, not knowing what it involved, probably around my early teens, that side of it never appealed to me. What the side that appealed to me was the reading experiences I had at that time. I might be reading John Fowles' The Magus or Sons and Lovers, which also had a huge influence on my dad, thinking, what an amazing gift it must be to kind of penetrate behind the surface of life like that. And I just thought, that's what I want to do. Of course, at that time, you've got no idea whether you're even capable of doing it, and, long road ahead. But it was not awards, and it was not celebrity status that I was seeking. If I had got it, I probably wouldn't have said no. I'm not trying to sound too worthy here. It's just that the truth is those weren't the things that drew me to it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, time now to hear the first of our archive pieces. For the last decade, the Royal Literary Fund has been building up a bank of recordings of writers talking about all aspects of the writing life. And on this podcast, we dip into the archive to bring you the riches within. So now we'll hear the playwright Shelley Silas responding to a prompt. What is inspiration? Where do we find it? Or does it find us?
New writers and friends will often ask, who inspires me? Where do I get my ideas and inspiration from? Every writer's different. Some go searching for inspiration, others sit patiently at their desks, staring at a blank piece of paper or an empty page on a screen, thinking up ideas, forcing ideas, seeking inspiration, even looking to other sources for that spark that will ignite an idea into something bigger. But ideas find their way to me. And when they arrive, a flashbulb goes off. I don't look for inspiration because that process has never worked for me. When, on occasion, I look, and I do find it, it leads to no more than a flurry of excitement when I honestly believe the inspiration has given birth to a sensational idea that will become a sensational piece of work and change my life. It has never happened. For me, inspiration is an unconscious act. I don't go around consciously dreaming up ideas. It might sound arrogant, but inspiration finds me, whether I'm in a supermarket or driving or reading or running or in the gym or walking around my local park or having dinner with my mum or watching TV or having a good old conversation. Somehow, during any one of those activities, I can be inspired as a result of a comment or thought that has led to another thought that has given me the idea. And that's when I know I'm onto something good, so I run with it, because inspiration for me is totally unexpected. Every writer's inspired by different things. Perhaps their routine dictates how ideas will be shaped. Some writers have strict regimes, getting up early, working for 4 or 5 hours, exercising and then doing something else for the rest of the day. Others travel or read the newspapers, finding inspiration in others' stories. Inspiration's everywhere, in nature, in the world. I was inspired to adapt a novel for radio because of a well-known cookery programme. A chef happened to be in the city where the novel was based and mentioned the book in passing. Another radio series was inspired while I was being deafened by magpies in the park. I began saying the adage about magpies, 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, and the idea for a series arrived. I'm a writer who often goes without any inspiration for days and weeks, but I've learned to accept this time when inspiration has taken a vacation. It's during these times that I think I'll never have another idea and start contemplating other professions I could turn to. And all the time I know that this is my pattern, this is my process, and when inspiration finally comes, it will come with an abundance of surprises and ideas and in generous amounts and stay with me until it next takes a break.
The playwright Shelley Silas there talking about inspiration. There was a line in there that really chimed with me, and that was when Shelley said, I can be inspired as a result of a comment or thought that has led to another thought, and that has given me the idea. And when I look back on my writing life, that's certainly what happened to me, rather than the conscious act of seeking ideas, which tends to leave me feeling as though the well of inspiration has dried up. I suppose it's a bit of a cliche to ask a writer where ideas come from, but it is a question I'm going to have to ask you today, because just recapping the list of some of the big subjects of your history books, an international history of terrorism, the Pyrenees in history, Europe and immigration, the conquest of Patagonia. Matt Carr, where do those ideas come from?
That's an interesting question, right? I mean, there's a lot in what you said that I can relate to, really. I like the idea of the sort of mundanity of daily experience in which an idea can suddenly come. But as I was listening to it, I was thinking also it depends on what you mean by ideas, really. I mean, when I was younger and I first started to write, I used to write a lot of poetry. And poetry, I always thought you had to be in some sort of state of Dylan Thomas-esque inebriation or some state of semi-ecstasis, deep emotion for the poem to be worth anything. And so, I did that for a while, and then I began to notice those moments didn't always come. You can't manufacture them. And I began to learn that writing was also craft, and that I was not going to be Arthur Rimbaud and write my best work by the time I was 19 and then go off to Ethiopia or somewhere. That wasn't going to happen. If I was going to do this, it was going to be a long haul. So then I began to think in terms of craft. And the way I work, for many years I've worked like this, I will sit for hours in front of a blank computer.
Wow.
Because I don't like to walk away, that's why. Mm-hmm. I feel discipline is very important, and I feel if I get into that state when I think, I can take a day off, how many more days will I take off? So it's a little bit neurotic that keeps me there. The other thing about ideas, there's an idea like something you want to write about. That can sometimes be influenced by what a publisher will want to publish. It took me a long time to learn that. There is something I might like to write about in my way, but nobody's ever going to publish them. So I have to make the choice. Am I just going to continue being in that burrow, writing things that only I want to write in the way that I want to write them and no one will publish them, or will I find ways? So then you begin to think of ideas, not just your ideas you can sell, ideas that people will publish, and hopefully keeping them true to yourself. I don't write stuff I don't want to write. And last but not least, this whole ideas business is also, for me, it's a question of saying something well. My wife sometimes says that I'm not always paying attention because I've got too much prose in my head. She's not wrong. She's not wrong. I often find in conversation, maybe this happens to most of us, most writers, that a part of you is always thinking about that paragraph you're working on, or how did you put this? And suddenly, zing, it will come to you. That's how you put it. And so that's a kind of way of an idea as well. And yes, I can't go looking for it. I just scratch and wait until it finally appears.
That's interesting, because it sounds as if you're crafting the idea, that because there is an idea, there is a kind of cliche perhaps again, of the initial impetus, the moment of realization. Boom, I know what my next book is. I know the story. Does that happen to you, or are you actually sitting at the blank screen?
It definitely happens, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a story at the end of it. I mean, for example, the book I'm working on at the moment, I've just sent off a proposal to my publisher about the Atacama Desert. And I want to do a book that is a kind of like sort of philosophical, political journey through the Atacama Desert and that landscape, and kind of reflect on things like time and death and bereavement, because I lost my mother a couple of years ago. And so I want to bring in a bit more of a personal element than I have brought in the last few books. But the actual place, the Atacama, came to me while I was in Patagonia. I can remember, I just was completely mesmerized by these vast Patagonian landscapes. I felt as if I'd entered a new world, obviously a really old world, which is what Darwin himself found, of course, when he went there. And I thought, I want more of this. Where can I get it? I thought. And then, I don't know where it was, the subject of the Atacama Desert came up, and that was the light bulb moment. Zing, the Atacama Desert, yes. So I'll try and put a book together about that.
So while researching your last book, you found the impetus for the next book.
Well, the next idea. We'll see if it comes off.
Yeah.
But I mean, for the last few years now, I'm very comfortable with writing about place. I like to kind of immerse myself in a place and experience it physically, see it, smell it, speak to the people in it, reach into the history of it, see what everybody's written about it, and completely lose myself in that. And, I've done that with the Pyrenees and then with Patagonia. Patagonia was tempted a little bit because it wasn't only about Patagonia, it was about the ideas that came out of Darwin's journeys through Patagonia. But nevertheless, there was a strong sense of place in that book too. So there's a logical development in a way to be able to write something at my age of a book like this, if I get the chance to do it. And so this is another technique we all have to learn, really, when pitching non-fiction books, is the art of the proposal, which is a task I hate, because you have to bluff your way through it, basically. You have to give the impression that you know a lot more than you actually know and still make it seem engaging and worth publishing. And you haven't really got your teeth into it. You don't really entirely know how it's going to turn out. So that's the stage I'm at now with this.
And do you have to do that multiple times to get the one success?
Many times.
Is that do you have multiple ideas that you pitch and one of them lands, or do you keep refining one idea until you find a place for it?
It depends, really. I mean, I used to work as a freelance journalist sometimes when I lived in Spain, and there were times when that was a little bit like monkey tennis, you know. You just have to, you want to make a living being a freelance journalist, and you don't have any specialist topic. You're just in Spain, say. That's where you are. You're in Spain. So you really rack your brains week after week. So in a way, it's quite useful in a way. You have to be quite nimble. Because you have to come out with dozens of ideas, some of them about things you don't even know the slightest thing about and never even thought about until zing, you suddenly thought you saw something in a paper and you thought, they might be interested in that, and so on. So that's kind of quite sort of, partly I might be interested in it, but partly it's just like, how can I make money out of this? How can I make a living as a freelance journalist? That's quite different though to actually writing books.
Yes.
Then I don't write books because I want to make money. I wouldn't say no to making money. I'm not saying anything to the contrary, but I write books that I want to write, otherwise they're just not worth it. I've never written anything that I didn't want to write.
And how long does it take for you to write a book?
The longest was probably the history of terrorism. And you can probably imagine why, because, the history of terrorism, it's like 200 odd years of bleak history. And I remember at that time, that was about 3.5 years, partly because it was a learning curve for me, how to do a nonfiction book. The memoir was one thing, but this was different. This was actually a cultural history of terrorism. So for about 2.5 to 3 years, I read almost every single book I could think of about terrorism, no matter how bad, because understanding terrorism is also about understanding bad books. You have to read a lot of bad books because a lot of nonsense has been talked about it. So, you need to kind of penetrate that and look at the stereotypes and the different views that people were putting forth. But on average, I would say from proposal stage to finish, 2.5 years probably.
Yeah, so it's quite a long time to stay with an idea. Do you ever lose faith along the way? And
Never, not in that time. Ironically, actually, a family friend of ours is a biographer of Mary Shelley, and she's worked on that her entire life. She's one of the world's experts on Mary Shelley, and her books are sold in universities. She spent about 30 years. I remember saying once that I spent 2.5 years doing a book, and her husband said to me, "That's not much time, Matthew." And so, that's a different attitude to doing a book. But I actually find that my mind is quite restless. So beyond 2.5 years, I'd probably start thinking about something else I want to write about. So 2.5 years just about does it.
Now, you've described yourself as a non-specialist writing about history, and you've said that presents challenges, pitfalls and rewards. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, the non-specialist, I did a history degree, but obviously to become a historian, there's a lot more required than that. To give you an example of what I mean by that, when I wrote my book about the history of the Moriscos, the end of the purging of Muslim Spain, I was aware that I knew nothing about it, except the occasional newspaper article that I read. And even then, it wasn't much back in the 90s. And I actually wrote the book finished it in 2010, 2011. I knew that this was a very specialist subject in which people had been working at for maybe 40, 50 years. So you go into a subject like that as if you're traveling to another country. You recognise that this country has human beings in it, like you, with perennial concerns that you would find in any society, any time. At the same time, you recognise it has very specific ideas and social forces people are responding to. And you recognise the reason you know this is because people have been there before you and staked out the terrain. But because I make my task to kind of communicate these kind of subjects to people who don't know about them, that gives me a certain amount of freedom. Historians, for example, would not necessarily make the kind of political comparisons that I did between the sort of construction of the Muslim enemy in the 21st century and the way Muslims were imagined in 17th and 16th century Spain. But I can do that because I'm a non-specialist. Historians would be very strict in thinking, no, you don't do that, this is history. So in some of the books, not all of them, I pay tribute to the historians who've been there before me, the ones who spent 20 or 30 years in archives. I mean, and I'm also amazed by their skill. You know, I mean, when I see some of these stories about how historians have spent 20 or 30 years in parish archives in Spain, and they're able to tell these extraordinary stories of things that happened 400 years ago about what people might have done, convincing, compelling stories. I just think that's such a gift. It's not something I would do, but I do appreciate it and have used it. Not misused it, I hope, but they basically laid the ground for me to walk on.
Now, as I mentioned at the start, you're also a novelist. So we talked about non-fiction there. Was there a freedom in making things up after writing history books when you came to
Definitely, because I mean, I didn't intend to be a journalist or a non-fiction writer when I started out. You know, I'm sure this happens to many of us, that your writing life takes you in areas where you didn't expect to be by the end of it. Poetry is what I started out doing, and then I thought I wanted to be a novelist. But for various reasons, that didn't happen until much later. I ended up doing a lot of non-fiction first. But I always used to find, as a journalist, I remember once interviewing the mayor of Sarajevo in 1992. That was when Sarajevo was just being bombed. And I just thought, and he gave this incredible speech, you know, this incredible, brave, moving, humanist speech about why is Europe not helping us. And I just thought, when you meet people like that, you just think there's a whole story here about this person, about their world, their family, their society that you're not getting, because all you're going to do is write a 1,000-word piece or a 5-minute interview, if that. So I always felt, you know, there's stuff I always think, well, what else happened? And the same with the past. You know, you read about people like Philip II, who has rightly the reputation of being this kind of rather harsh, despotic Spanish king, the terror of Christendom and so on. Yet when you read about his private life, there's a whole kind of side to him, this tragic life he had. He lost about 7 children, and 3 or 4 of his wives died. He was quite a sort of tender, warm, insecure person with incredible personal courage, matched with total fanaticism regarding matters of religion and politics. So yes, it was a great privilege for me to get the chance to make him a character. Having written about him in my book about the Moriscos in a more formal way, Philip did this, Philip did that, to actually think, okay, well, what was he like? What did he say? What did he think about when he was in his bed at night, and so on and so forth? You know, that never ceases to be interesting.
And at the end of the writing day, did it feel any different when you've been making things up all day as opposed to translating or trying to bring together elements of historical truths? To
be honest, I find that if a day goes well, a writing day goes well, whether it's non-fiction or fiction, it makes no difference. You still feel this incredible feeling of elation. Even after years and years of doing it, it never goes away. But I have to say that there are often days of complete frustration. In fact, my wife said to me when I was writing the Darwin book, I was saying, "Oh my God, this book, I cannot write it. It's just not coming out. It's just not happening. There's nothing original here." And she said, "Yeah, well, that's what you said about the last 5." And she's not wrong. You know, you forget that. I know it sounds a little bit sort of Jesuitical to talk about writing like that.
Yes.
But nevertheless, you know, when I've occasionally had young people say to me, "Well, what do you need to do to be able to be a writer?" I say, "To be able to put up with that."
Yeah.
To be able to put up with that. Because
Yes.
It doesn't always go well. You know, and you can't, if you think you're going to sit there and it's just going to come, this beautiful prose is going to come swimming out of you, forget about it. You know, you need to work at it and you need to stick with it. So when you do have those moments of elation, they are worth the effort. And they come from any kind of writing, frankly.
I agree. And what does the writing day look like for you? When do you begin? When do you end? How does it work?
Nowadays I try and play tennis a couple of times a week. I used to be much more, you know, nothing in the week, just writing. And maybe do some exercise in the evening. But I've realised actually there's not necessarily, you know, these hours that I was talking about earlier when you sit staring at a computer, that's not an entirely sensible way to go about it sometimes. Sometimes it actually can work if you pull away a little bit and go and do something else. So I get up, I have breakfast, I go to the desk, I sit there.
What time is it? What time are we talking about?
I usually start around 9,
Yep.
except when I'm playing tennis, so it'll be like half 11, 12. And then I'll work throughout till about 5 or 6. Maybe have a little break here and there. Yeah, and also it depends on the level where you are in the book. You know, because when I was finishing off the Darwin book, it was 11 or 12 hours a day because they wanted the deadline brought forward. So, you know, I had to do a lot more. Some of those hours, you look back on the day and you think nothing happened. And then, like, just when you're about to pack up, you're thinking, oh, well, I ought to go now at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Zing, you get the zing moment. And suddenly the prose starts singing. And you feel, okay, I'm going to stay with this as long as it takes.
Absolutely. It's always so interesting to know how other people are working to pry into their lives.
I don't know if I used to read when I was younger, these the Paris Review interviews with writers. And I loved those interviews because they all went so much into the nuts and bolts of it all. I found that kind of made writing seem real, doable. It was actually, because it's a bit daunting, this idea of the genius, the genius with the kind of these great moments of inspiration, if you don't have them.
Yes.
And so to hear writers who I did respect a lot saying, well, actually, it's quite hard work. I do this. I use this kind of pencil. I use this typewriter. I smoke this amount of cigarettes. I liked all that, all that kind of nuts and boltsy stuff.
Well, time now for another visit to our own archive, and it's one particular archive that's the subject of this piece, by a novelist who's written a lot of books for younger readers, Linda Hoy.
I discovered the first volume in the archive room of the Sheffield Quaker Meeting House, leather-bound and hand-tooled, its crisp pages tightly packed with fine flowing copperplate, and I was intrigued. Essays written by 19th century Quakers on such diverse subjects as silkworm rearing, how to keep a pet chameleon, the higher education of women, and the advisability or otherwise of giving spare change to beggars on the street. Poems rejoicing in the delights of nature, pieces on pond life under a microscope, the art of falconry, essays on anti-vivisection and the changing role of women. But this voluminous archive turned out to be no more than the flashing grain of gold which indicates the whereabouts of a rich seam sequestered deep underground. For secreted in the vaults of the Sheffield City Archive, I unearthed another 40 volumes. Essays on the Queen's English, the best way to make toast. Tips for riding on the first velocipedes in Sheffield. More and more poetry and exceptionally beautiful paintings. Still life, local views, vibrant colour, pen and ink drawings. Each annual volume containing the output of 10 months' work, with each month having many varied contributions. This archive is the collected work of a small number of Sheffield Quaker families. In the early years, of course, Quakers were strict Puritans, eschewing music, dance and painting. They dressed in plain grey, observed plain speech and addressed plain walls. They performed good works by the bucket load, opposing war, campaigning for prison reform and for more civilised treatment of the mentally ill, but they were culturally barren. Like the Northumberland Pitman painters, starved of light and colour, whose repression led to an explosion of leisure time artwork, these Quakers found an outlet for their creativity through regular meetings where they performed each other's work, shared poetry and prose, and graced their lives with colour. As an anonymous writer wrote in Volume 2, beauty and learning intimately blent, the peacock's feathers and the nightbird's song, the old man's wisdom and the young man's frolic, some set in gems, some strong in their own plainness. Rules of the Sheffield Pen and Pencil Society. The Society shall meet once a month to read and examine contributions from its members. These contributions may be of a very miscellaneous kind. Essays, reviews, accounts of travel, or any interesting adventure, either in prose or verse, or paintings, drawings, or other artistic productions. In fact, anything which will tend to interest and edify, but every essay must be, to some extent, original. The Pen and Pencil Society was more than just a culture club. To these repressed Puritans who avoided concerts and the theatre, it was a social outlet. Its members organised expeditions. One painting depicts the group attending a hydropathic establishment in Basel, and they even held an annual party in a city centre hotel, a temperance hotel, I hardly need to add. The group designed a shield to embellish each of their 40 volumes and even composed a rousing, inspirational song for the start of every meeting. Onward and upward, with true heart and mind, let us set forth on our way. Forward, no lingering, no lagging behind, there is no time for delay. Let us look upward, to where far away the hills everlasting rise, bathed soft in the light of an unclouded day, refreshing our wistful eyes.
I like the sense of excitement in Linda Hoy's voice there, recounting the wealth of stories emerging from her journeys through the vaults of the Sheffield City Archive. Do you relate to that? Have you experienced that sense of wonder?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I really like what she said about Sheffield, partly because it's about Sheffield, which is where I live, and also because she touches on kind of one of the sort of stratifications of Sheffield's radical history. You know, the Quakers are part of that. It's that sense of surprise when there's a certain, on one level, there's a kind of recognition that these people who lived in an entirely different time to your own are different from you. And yet they're the same. They're human beings. And it's that kind of pleasure that she takes in that, of discovering a side to people that shouldn't have been there, is not supposed to have been there, that breaks the stereotype. And yes, I can remember that. I mean, when I wrote my novel, The Devils of Cardona, one or two people in the States, one or two right-wing critics said, "This is woke," they said, which is, to me, pretty much a meaningless word used in that context, but let's go with it. What they meant was, you can't have gay characters. And, and I thought, well, being gay didn't begin with Stonewall. People were gay in the 16th century, and they had to survive in far more difficult environments than now. So why can't I write about a gay character? But it's that idea that people have this idea about the past.
And was that something that you discovered in an archive?
I discovered it originally through Inquisition trial archives, because quite a lot of gay people were hauled before the Inquisition. You could be flogged and possibly executed for that offence. Yeah. So, I mean, I did discover it then. And then I would ask myself, well, how did people actually get round this? Because the same with the Victorians. People think of the Victorians as being heavily moralistic and so on, which they were. But we also know the Victorians had a totally different side. There was a lot of vice, a lot of pleasure, illicit pleasure. So, people always find ways round the rules and the laws of the time. So another experience I had, which is actually much more similar to what Linda was describing. When I did my book about the Moriscos, I didn't publish many documents that hadn't already been published, even when I was using primary sources. But there was one exception, and that was when I was in the state archives, Spanish state archives in Simancas. And they gave me one of these big legajos, as they call them, these big sort of cardboard folders full of documents. And when you first see them, your heart sinks, because the handwriting is just written almost like a spider. And they're on these bits of yellow parchment and so on. And you wonder, can you even understand what this, read it in the first place, let alone understand the archaic Spanish that they were using. But these letters had not been published before. I'd never seen any reference to them. And they were written by Spanish mayors up and down Castile and Andalusia just after the rebellion of the Alpujarras, the Muslim revolt against the Spanish crown, which was then one of the worst civil wars Spain had ever had. And this Philip II, who we've just discussed, he punished the entire population, Muslim population of the Alpujarras, by removing them from Andalusia. So they were all put on a forced march, sent to Castile in the middle of winter. Many of them had no clothes at that time, old people, kids, women, the lot. So they were sent on this grim odyssey, which many, many died. And the image people have of Spain at that time is austere, harsh, brutal, fanatical Spain. That people would have approved of this. But what these documents, these letters, they were all little small letters written to the king by these mayors. And they all said things like, "Your Majesty, this is unacceptable. What are we supposed to do with these people? These are people dying in front of our eyes. What can we do to help them?" The king, of course, was nothing. You don't do anything to help them. But the fact is, right there, I just remember holding these bits of paper in my hands and think I'm touching history here, touching a chapter in history that's not been written, a whole chapter about Spain that has not been told. So I felt this huge satisfaction at coming across this. And also, it was an idea I was exploring, that Spain was not exactly what people said about it. So you're always looking for these contradictions when you look at the past, and that's what Linda captures so well in that extract about the Quakers.
And did you have that sense of walking away that day knowing you'd got something?
I did, definitely, yep. I mean, it's just one little chapter in my book, and this is another thing. I mean, I couldn't do it. I would have liked to have done it more justice, because there was a whole range of perspectives in these letters. I mean, there were something about 40 or 50 of them. Very short notes, all sent in haste to the king, because they were basically these people were just mayors of small towns or little villages. They had no resources to help these people. Some of them had cholera, which they were spreading to the Christian population and so on. So everything was in haste, and you could feel that even in the way the letters were, scrawled on these little bits of paper.
Is there something about the physical archive that allows you to, as you say, feel like you're holding history between your fingertips that you perhaps wouldn't get from a digitised version?
Definitely, that was one of them, yes. And also you're in the castle, the castle where the Simancas archive. It's quite a kind of impressive place, even though it's built right next to a motorway. Well, rather, the motorway was built next to it. It's quite an impressive place just to be in there. You feel Spanish history is breathing all around you, And so, yes, when these documents come in a cardboard folder and they're in your hands, you really do feel like you've discovered gold dust, really.
Have you always used archives in your research?
No, not always, and that's one of the, when I was saying earlier about why I'm the non-specialist. If I was always using archives, I wouldn't have been able to write as many books as I've written. So I rely a lot on secondary research. I once had a teacher who, at university at SOAS, where I went in London, who was the world's expert then in the East India Company. He'd spent 40 years in the archives of the East India Company. Obviously, he knew about other things apart from the East India Company, but he knew a lot about the East India Company. And I thought to myself at that time, no, I don't see myself doing that. And I never did.
I have a play of mine, the script of a play of mine has ended up in an archive because it was performed, one of the actors performing it in a radio play, this was Stephanie Cole, and she donated her archive to Bristol University. And it's listed as an annotated script. And part of me wants to go and see it because I want to see what she said, and part of me doesn't because I wasn't sure she was that impressed with the play. So at the moment I'm just leaving it there and not looking at it. But one day I'll have the courage to go and fish around in the archive and see what she wrote on the script.
That does sound exciting. Yeah, it reminds me actually of when I did a documentary once about the Portuguese poet Pessoa. I went to Lisbon. It was a radio program, a radio documentary, so we used some of Pessoa's poetry. But I also wanted sounds. And when you're in a city, it's quite difficult to get sounds, and I went to the Portuguese radio archives to see if they had any from his period, and they did. They had these street sellers. Each street seller had their own cry for whichever vegetable. And that was shivers down your spine stuff, to hear the people shouting, aubergine, in some kind of ancient voice from the 20s or 30s. Yeah. So we use that.
Sound archives are amazing.
They are.
Now, if you want to get in touch with us to share any questions or ideas for future episodes, you can do so by using hashtag RLFcollected on social media. And that is what the following unnamed writer did when they contacted us with a question. Can you do something about the uncertainty, they say? We don't know which book will be picked up or if it will sell when it's published. Increasingly, we don't know when editors and agents will reply, or, with ghosting being so common, if they'll ever reply. There's a lot of waiting and not knowing with being a writer. Now, I can certainly identify with those words.
Me too.
How do you deal with uncertainty?
$1 million question, really. I just think of Kafka's The Hunger Artist. I always think of it when people ask that kind of question. When at the end of The Hunger Artist, and he's starving himself to death beautifully for this audience, the best hunger artist ever. And they say to him, why did you do this? How did you find the strength? He just said, I couldn't find anything I wanted to eat. And I think that is part of it. That, that uncertainty, I would say I've had it since I was about 17. It's all connected with writing. Because, before you've actually published anything, you don't know if you ever will. You don't know if anything you write will be worth anything. You don't know if you'll be as good as you'd like to be, or at least as good as the writers you admire are. So there's that. And even when you get published, you're not necessarily secure, because it depends whether, did your book do really well this year? Did it do well enough for the publishing company to want to publish the sequel? Not always. The uncertainty is constant. And so all I can say, and once again, I don't want to sound too worthy about this, or martyrly in the least, because it's a life that I chose and that all of us choose. But you have to be prepared to live with it. You have to be prepared to find a way to deal with things that don't go well always, and really appreciate things when they do go well. I mean, put it this way, there's no other kind of life I would have chosen, no matter how difficult things have got.
So it's worth it.
Absolutely, is it worth it? Yeah. I mean, to say writing is, it allows you to live twice, and to live more than twice. It gives you a richness and depth of experience that I just could not get anywhere else. So yes, I wouldn't mind it if things had been more secure, if there'd been an easy stepping stone from one stepping stone to the next, and I'd known what that route was. Maybe I would have done things differently when I was younger and so on. But no, you end up with the trajectory that you've got. It was and still is an incredibly rewarding thing to be doing, even in a time where writers and writing are not always given much credibility outside the world of awards and celebrity. Even when you're in the shadows, it's still worth sticking with it.
So I noticed that you're a writer with a lot of strings to your bow, including co-presenting the very entertaining podcast Grim Up North and writing a regular Substack. I wonder if things like this that you're in control of help with the waiting and the uncertainty. In
a way, yes, because they are things that I don't have to worry about what anybody else is going to say about them. The newsletter that I have, the Substack, that's mostly sort of political writing, more overtly political writing, not entirely, but mostly. And I like to be able to speak in my own voice there without any editor cutting me back. I'm not necessarily saying that's a good thing, because it can be useful to have an editor telling you that, but I feel free in that space. I'm not obliged to anybody, to any publisher or anything. But not every writer can do that. I think partly because I worked as a freelancer in the past. Being a freelancer, I used to imagine it freelance. The word had a sort of magic about it. You complete your own person, but actually you never are. You never are, because you're basically always obligated to a whole range of different people. But it does teach you to think lots of different things at the same time. And also not every kind of writing can do the same thing for you. If I was to write in a book the way I write in Substack, the books wouldn't be what they are, for better or worse, and vice versa.
But this idea of waiting and nothing happening is, what do you say to somebody who's experiencing that? What do you do to manage those periods of time?
It depends what you're waiting for, really. If you're waiting for money, for a publishing deal, for fame, for celebrity status, any of those things,
perhaps for some,
you might be waiting a long time.
Perhaps it's just recognition.
Recognition
that somebody else believes in you.
I think, yeah, of course, absolutely. And that is so important for all of us. All I can say is, the way I've dealt with it is I just keep coming back to the actual work itself. I don't want to say that I've not had those moments, because I think if I look back on the last decades of this, there have been moments when you just feel, was this really worth it for all this? But then you think to yourself, well, what else would you have done? And there's never an answer. There's never a clear, not for me anyway, there's never a clear answer. So now I think at the age of, coming up to 70, I don't have those doubts anymore. I don't ask myself what else I could have done. The uncertainty, the difficulties, the challenges, the things when things go wrong have all been part of this particular trajectory that I had to be on. And so if you're younger, I just say that may not happen to you. You may find a very straightforward route to get to where you want to be. But if you want to be a writer worth anything, you have to be able to put up with the possibility that they might not go your way.
And coming back to something you said earlier, you talked about the discipline of work, of writing every day, of staring at the blank screen if necessary, of not taking a day off, but keeping at it. Yeah. That's important?
It is for me. I need this feel of I'm going to the office. I need to feel that's part of my daily life is having those hours in which I write. And, at the end of the day, yes, you might feel your head's tied up in knots. you've written some dreary paragraph, you look at it and you think, did I write that? Did I spend all these hours just to write that? And the answer is yes. But then you might find out, you wake up the next morning, you look at what you've written and you think, no, that wasn't that bad. There's something there. And then you work on it and so on. And there's that kind of constant raking over day after day that is all part of the process.
Thank you, Matt. Time now for the latest RLF news with Anne Morgan.
A novel built around birthdays is among the books by Royal Literary Fund Fellows launching this month. Cynthia Rogerson's 100,000 Birthdays begins with the first birthday of its narrator, before rewinding to the first birthday of her many times great-grandfather, a microbe called Kevin, bobbing in a not very salty sea. Published by Sparsile Books, it is part memoir, part philosophical musing, and part ode to the universe. For more information, visit sparsilebooks.com. Halloween has inspired an RLF fellow to adapt her illustrated spoken word show for 2 special performances this month. Joining forces with conservationist and wildlife presenter Ajay Tagala, prose writer Zoe Howe will bring together folk magic, ecology and ghosts galore for the Halloween special version of Witching the Wild Year. The pair will be appearing at the haunted Talbot Hotel in Oundle, Northamptonshire on the 30th of October and at the Kirk Theatre, Pickering in North Yorkshire on the 31st of October. Howe and Tagala's book, Witching the Wild Year, will be published in 2027 by the History Press. RLF Fellows are making strides in theatre this autumn. In Glasgow, Flight, the stage adaptation of Caroline Brothers' novel Hinterland, will be at the iconic Citizens Theatre for a limited run from the 6th to the 15th of November as part of its grand reopening after a major refurbishment. Meanwhile, Aisha Zia has been announced as the new artistic director of Kali Theatre Company. Founded in 1991 by RLF fellow Ruxana Ahmed, the company has a deep commitment to platforming South Asian voices. Speaking about her appointment, Zia said she wanted Kali to be a home for leaders and theatre makers, with Kali hubs across the UK. Together, we will create bold, groundbreaking work. An audio drama by an RLF fellow has been shortlisted for Best Adaptation in the inaugural British Audio Awards, the Speakies. Produced by Granny Eats Wolf and directed by Celia de Wolf, Roy Williams' Gatsby in Harlem also received nominations for Best Ensemble and Best Performance for Nakuti Gatwa. Winners will be announced on the 24th of November. And finally, a Royal Literary Fund Fellow has been shortlisted for the 2025 Booker Prize. Andrew Miller's novel The Land in Winter tells the story of 2 couples snowed in the West Country during the Great Freeze of December 1962. It joins novels by 2006 Booker Prize winner Kieran Desai and American short story writer Susan Choi on the 6-strong shortlist. The winner will be announced at a ceremony in London on the 10th of November. And now, back to the studio.
Well, that's the end of this episode of Collected, and time for me to thank this week's guest, Matt Carr, for his words and insights. If you have any comments or writing questions you'd like to hear RF Fellows discuss, please tweet using the hashtag RLF Collected. And with that, this is me, Paul Dodgson, saying goodbye.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLF Collected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.